What's going on, guys? It's Cooper Codes, and in this video, I'm going to work on a searcher for the Spotify API in React. The basic idea of the application is that you can type in your favorite artist's name, for example, Taylor Swift, and take a look at all the different albums they have on Spotify. If we were to put in a different artist, like Kanye West, for example, we're going to then see all the different Kanye West albums available on Spotify. Let's get started by getting set up with the Spotify API. So if you go to developer.spotify.com/dashboard, you'll be brought to this site. You're then going to log in with your Spotify account. You can also use a free Spotify account and still access the API, so you don't need to pay for anything. So in order to use the Spotify API, you have to create an application through their dashboard here. So press the Create an App button over here, give it a name, and then press Create. You're then going to see this overview page. The two important things you're going to need from this page are your client ID and then your client secret. Once you have access to these two things, we are good to go with starting our React application. All right, so open up whatever text editor you want to use and make sure you have a terminal in the folder where we're going to create the project. We're going to start by creating our application by using create React app. So we're going to say npx create-react-app, and then I'm going to name it client. Once create React app is finished, you can go into the client folder by saying cd client. Now we are inside of a React application, and we're going to have to install a couple things. For this application, I'm going to create a very simple front end by using Bootstrap and react-bootstrap. So we're going to have to npm install those packages so we can use them in our React application. So we can say npm install bootstrap and then react-bootstrap. So once that's done, let's open up source, go into app.js, and you'll see our basic boilerplate React application. Let's just delete the entire header so we have a nice empty application. At the top here, we're going to manually import Bootstrap so our application can use the Bootstrap CSS. So we're going to say bootstrap/dist/css/bootstrap.min.css. This line is necessary because it's a CSS file used in the React Bootstrap libraries. So if we use any components, as I'll show you guys in a second, they need access to this CSS file. So now we're going to import a couple things from React Bootstrap. So we can say import, and then we can do curly braces, which means we want to start importing specific things from a certain library. So we can say import, keep the curly braces empty for now, from react-bootstrap. If you look into the React Bootstrap documentation, there is a bunch of different components you can use. Components is pretty much a bunch of HTML and CSS that's already generated for you and is documented for you to use. It's kind of why these component libraries exist, like Bootstrap. For our application, we're going to have containers to kind of put everything in a container so it focuses to the middle of the screen. We are then going to have an input group, which is pretty much where we store that searcher, the actual text input for searching. Inside of that text input, we have a form control, which is pretty much just a fancy way of saying a text input. And then we have a button, which is a button like you'd expect. When we load in all of our different albums, we're loading them into something that's called a row. I'll show you guys how that works later in the tutorial. And then we're loading in these things called cards, which is kind of how every single album has its own little box to live in. So we can npm start our application right now just to make sure that it's blank and nothing's there. And then we can go back and take a look at it as we get started on the UI side of things. All right, so we have a fully white page, which is exactly what we'd expect. Because if we go over to our application, we're going to see we just have a div with nothing inside of it. I'm going to start by wrapping our entire application in a container. This allows us to have things like rows, and it also just allows us to have our application be centered, which I'll show you guys in a second. Inside of our container, we're going to start with having an input group. This is where our form control and our kind of text input and button are going to live. This input group has a couple things we can do to it. One thing is we can give it a class name of margin bottom -3. Everything in Bootstrap is kind of surrounded these certain class names. And if we give an input group a class name of margin bottom 3, it's going to have a margin on the bottom of it that's a size of 3 in Bootstrap. The input group itself also has a size. We can say size equals large. And if you're curious for your own project for different sizes when it comes to input groups, different class names, or just different classes in general, take a look at the documentation. You can look up something like input group, documentation, size, and it will show you all the different options in a really easy to understand way. So inside of our input group, we're going to have two things, a button and a text input. So let's start with the text input. For input groups, the text input is called the form control component. The reason why they have this interesting form control component is because forms kind of want us to have access to a bunch of different functionality you might not just have in a regular text input. For example, we have a placeholder, which we're going to say search for artist. This is that placeholder text you'll see kind of in gray before you start typing in things. We're going to have a type, which is equal to input. And we're also going to do some interesting things here where the form control has an event for us to pick up on. And it's an event called onKeyPress. So we can do some code here, which is pretty cool, where you can take that event and pass it in to some logic here. Once you're inside these curly braces, you can pretty much write JavaScript code to interpret or handle a certain event that's coming from the onKeyPress. For example, in our case, if the person presses enter, we want to run our search function. So if event.key, which is something that comes from the event, is equal to the string of enter, then we know the user has pressed the enter button. And so for now, I'm just going to console.log pressed enter. Soon, we're going to have this call our actual search function, which we haven't created yet. Another property that gives us access to an event is onChange. And so for onChange, we want to have a string in our React that is always showing the value of the text input in this form control. So what we're going to do to hold that value is to create a React state. So at the top of our application, we can say import use state, and also in a different part of the tutorial, we're going to use effect as well. So we're just going to import both of those for now, and we're going to say import them from React. This isn't exactly a use state tutorial, but down here, I'm going to have a const, and I'm going to name it search input and set search input. And it's going to be equal to use state with an empty string. Oh, and it doesn't like that we have this onChange here. What's happening here is search input is the value of our state, and set search input is how we change the value of our state. Initially, that state value is an empty string. So you could kind of imagine this like a variable in a programming language, except with a little bit of different steps when it comes to changing the value of that variable. It's a little tricky because search input is technically a const, but when you use this set search input function, you can change the value of search input. An example of changing the value is when our text changes in our form, we can get that onChange event, capture the event like this, pass it in to set search input of the event.target.value. The target is going to be the form control pretty much, and that form is going to have a certain value. And so it's going to get the text value of whatever your form control has. So this is great. We now have a variable we can use where it has the input our user has put into the search bar. We also want to provide a button for the user to click on if they prefer to press a button instead of pressing enter, for example. So we can say button, and right now this button is actually doing nothing, but if we say on click, when the user clicks it, we can make it call a function. Right now, we can just say something like console.log hello. That's going to be annoying. You can technically do this, and let's say clicked button. It doesn't like when we just do a regular console.log because it's expecting some type of event or something to get captured initially. So we're just pointing the event into a function here, but it's not using the event inside of here. And we could technically do this, just so you guys are aware of that, I guess, but I don't want this to be too confusing. Pretty much when we click on it right now, it's going to say clicked button, but eventually it's going to call a search function instead. So make sure you to npm start your application and we can go back and see our new components. All right, and if you inspect your application and you go to the console, you're going to be able to see some cool stuff. So I'm going to type in cool stuff, and if I press enter, I should see press enter over here, which is great news. And if I press search, I should see some type of search thing pop up. Clicked button. So this is great news. Remember, software development's all about doing things one thing at a time. We know that if we can do a console.log statement, then we can do a lot of other code inside of there, such as calling the search function after we've created it. As long as these are logging things, that means we can have more advanced code where the actual console.logs live right now. All right, and so now we're going to make a different container to show off the results of our API calls. So right now we don't have any actual data to show that we're going to get from the Spotify API, but we can still make a basic example of what the card might look like. So the card is that object that is holding the album, what it looks like, and then also the album title. And so we can make a card like this, and then we can set a card.image. And for now, I'm just going to put the source equal to a hashtag, which just means nothing. Then I'm going to set a card.body. This means in the body of the card, we're going to have something. For now, it's just going to be the card.title. And you guys will see, this is the first example where I'm showing you a component where there's kind of like subcomponents, where card has a certain thing for handling the image of a card or handling the body of a card. And for example, this title, we can just say album name. And so if we go back to our application, we're then going to see a little album name here with an obviously not loading image. And so how do we get a bunch of these to show up? Okay, we're going to have to make sure that we have a row inside of this container. And so we can say row and then class name is equal to. We can start by putting the mx2 class. mx2 is just going to give us some margin around our row components. And then we're also going to say row to kind of declare that this needs the bootstrap row class. And then also row-calls-4. This means that your row is going to have 4 different columns. And so we can actually take this card element and put it inside of our row. And so let's save that and see what this looks like now. All right, so you'll see, obviously we don't have a real image, which is totally fine for now, but let's try and put this card image a couple of times in our row. So let's do 4. I pretty much took that card and I copied it over 4 different times. If I save this, then I go here, you guys will see we now have 4 different albums inside of our searcher. And so the most interesting part about this is, what if I put one more card? Well, we can kind of see that each card is taking up 1 column in this row. And so if I have 5, what I would expect is 4 cards on the top, and then that 5th card is going to make another row under it. And you can see in your application, it's going to be handled like this. So this is super great. That means that no matter how many albums we receive from the Spotify API, we can be able to load them forever, pretty much. It's going to keep doing this functionality where if there are more than 4 things in a row and a 5th one gets introduced, it's going to get bumped to the next row, if that makes sense. This seems simple, but this is actually a really interesting topic to understand, because whenever you're creating applications, you're creating things that need to kind of dynamically load in data, and sometimes you don't know how much data you're going to be loading in. Things like rows and Bootstrap are a great way of solving this problem. And so let's delete these cards and just keep 1. Eventually, we're going to have some album data from Spotify where we're going to say, okay, for every single album coming from Spotify, create this card, which we're going to get into at the end of the tutorial once our Spotify stuff is fully set up. All right, so the basic idea of our front end is fully finished. Now we can kind of get into setting up that Spotify API code. At the top of our application, I'm going to have our const client underscore ID that we're going to grab from Spotify. And I'm also going to have the const client underscore secret, which we're going to grab from Spotify. So you should have this page, which you got to earlier in the tutorial, and you're going to want to grab your client ID and client secret and bring them over to your application. Before we get into things, let's just set up how we're going to run our initializing of the Spotify API code. We're going to use the use effect code. We're going to pass in an empty arrow function here. And at the end of our use effect, I'm going to put a comma here and then put an empty array. This is the very basic syntax in React for having a function run only once when you start your React application. This is great for things like setting up an API call or setting up the client for interacting with an API. You only want to run that once. You don't want your application to attempt to reconnect to an API like every single time your code gets refreshed, right? That would be incredibly inefficient and you'd probably run out of API calls very fast. And so Spotify is interesting. They have this concept of the API access token, where in order to get this access token, you have to make a specific request to the Spotify API to get a token for a certain client to use. And so that request is going to look like this. We're going to fetch to the https accounts.spotify.com/API/token. This is the URL we need to interact with when we want to get this initial API access token, so we can do things like make API calls, like make search calls to Spotify specifically. And so Fetch has the option to have different parameters or, initialization parameters, as they kind of say here, in your request. And so we can pass in that object of parameters because for Spotify, they make it strangely complex. So let's say var auth parameters. And this name of the variable doesn't matter, but it's going to be an object that we're going to pass into our fetch. And we're going to want to pretty much tell our fetch what exactly do we want to do. Well, in order to get the API access token, Spotify asks us to do a post operation. So we're going to make sure we call it post. And then we're also going to need to pass in this unique header, which is outlined in the Spotify documentation. They want specifically this, where you have to say the content type of your request is equal to application/x-www-form-URL encoded. And there are no ideas for me coming here. This is exactly what Spotify asks us to do when we make a request to get our access token. Then we're going to need the body of the request to pass in all the different parameters that Spotify requires to get this access token. The first thing Spotify wants is the grant_type to be set to client_credentials. Then when you pass in variables like this to fetch, in this body, you're going to want to have an ampersand in between each variable you're giving to the fetch request. So this next variable is going to be the client underscore ID is equal to, and make sure you have this equal sign here, super important. Then we can use that client underscore ID const we created above here. And then we're also going to want to have another ampersand, which means another variable for our client underscore secret. That's the name of the variable. And we're setting it equal to the value of our client underscore secret const above. And so we can pass this object of authorization parameters into fetch. What's happening here is we're saying, hey, make a call to this HTTPS here using fetch. And this auth parameters gives that fetch call the specific rules of how it needs to go about things. The rules being, make sure it's a post request, make sure that the headers are of this certain content type, and make sure that the body has this information. And with that specific information, we can then do a .then statement, which is going to catch the promise that fetch provides. Because if you look at fetch here, it's giving us a promise. And so pretty much .then is waiting for the promise to be fulfilled, and we can do something with the result of that promise. So we can say result of the promise, we can just name it result, do an arrow function, and then we want to get the result into a JSON format. Our next .then statement is going to catch this result.json, and then we can use it right here is pretty much what's happening. And so we can say, call it data, and then I'm just going to say console.log data. So right now, if we run our application, when we run it for the first time, when we refresh the page, for example, we are going to then have this use effect get called. So let's go back to our console. Let's just restart our app and say another npm start. So open up your console and then refresh the page. You're then going to see this access token, which is super great news. So use effect is actually running twice because we're in development mode. But for our case, that doesn't really matter because it's going to give us an access token at the end of the day. And this token right here that we're receiving is coming from this .then line right here, where it's saying, here is your token to then go and use the search function and other things in the Spotify API. And so we are going to want to save that token in our React application. Surprise, surprise, a great way to save a string in your React application is to go in and make a use state. So we can go up to the top here and say const access token, comma set access token is equal to a use state with an empty string. So instead of just console.logging the data, what we can do is let's see what data is. We're console logging data, so let's go to our app, and we can see that the data here is, if you say data.access underscore token, we're going to be having an access to this string here. This is great news because now we know where to save the string, right? Or where we can get the string to save. We know that if we go to data.access underscore token, we can then get access to that string. And let's just restart our application and look again. Refresh the page, and you'll see now we're getting access to that direct string. Now that we have access to that string, we can then save that string in our use state. So we can say set access token is then going to be passed in with that string here. So once we get a successful result from the use effect and then a successful result from this fetch, our access token is then going to be set from that point forward. In this application, I'm not doing any error handling as far as this fetch request failing goes. And so I'm just doing that for the simplicity of the video. If you guys want to see what type of error handling you should do with fetch, let me know in the comments. But this is really great news, is now we have a use effect where we have access to this access token, and we can then start developing with the actual Spotify API and making API calls. And so our application is going to be incredibly reliant on one function. That one function being search. Search is everything. This application, you press the search button, it shows you a result. And so this search function is going to be absolutely massive. And so let's get started with it. We're going to say async function search. And before you get scared, let me explain. We need this function to be asynchronous because inside of the function, we're going to have a lot of different fetch statements. And at each fetch statement, we kind of want to wait its turn is a good way to think about it. And I will show you guys in the code exactly what I mean. But if you ever need to use await, the keyword await, your function needs to be asynchronous is the easy way to understand it. And so at the top of our search function, we can make a little console.log that's nice and simple, showing that we are searching for the string that we have saved in our state above the search input. This is just making sure that we don't have any issues with the input and that it's actually showing what we'd expect. For example, like Taylor Swift is just an example I'll put here for you guys. And so before we get into the more complicated search code, let's go to our inputs and make sure that we actually call this search function when we press the input, like enter, for example. So at line 43 here, we can now say search, call the function like this. And instead of this code we have on the onClick here, we can just say search, which is then going to use the search function here. So let's run our application and take a look. If we press enter, we're going to see it's searching for hello, which is what we'd expect. Let's put like Taylor Swift in and then use the button. Now it's searching for Taylor Swift. This is great news because now we know that our text input is going to give whatever we have here, and then it's going to pass it into our search function, which is great news. It's always good to double check things like this when you're developing because you don't want to make any assumptions as far as your input goes. If you started looking up Taylor Swift and you are getting no results, that's going to be an issue, right? And so just making sure that the actual text input is what you put in, it kind of makes your life more simpler if you start getting bugs. So in the Spotify documentation, we're going to start by taking a look at the search function here. I recommend if you're doing something else for your project to take a look at the documentation here. It's super great and generally explains to you what you have to do. So there's a Q variable we are going to pass in for our query, and this is the kind of Taylor Swift string like we discussed before. And then we're also going to have a type array here as well. And so what we can do is we can pass in that string, for example, Taylor Swift, and then we're going to make sure that what we want the actual artist type to come back. Let's go back to our React code and do some comments to show what the flow of our API calls is going to look like. So it's going to be a two-step process. The first thing that we need is for Spotify, they really emphasize this thing about the artist ID. And so we're going to make a GET request using search to get the artist ID. And then we're going to use another GET request, and we're going to say, with artist ID, grab all the albums from that artist, then display those albums to the user. This is the basic idea of how we're going to get this search to work. So similar to before, we're going to have a fetch statement. And so we're going to say var artist ID is equal to await fetch, and then HTTPS api.spotify.com/v1/search. This is the kind of root URL we have here. And we're also going to pass in some parameters very similar to how we did it right here. So it's the same thing if we're going to pass in a parameters. So we're going to say var artist parameters is equal to an object, and the method is going to be of get. And this is all outlined in the Spotify documentation, is they want your request to come in at a very certain way, which is kind of why this video is helpful as well, because it's a bit confusing at times. They also want very specific headers, which are going to have a content type of JSON. So you can say content type application/JSON, and then an authorization header. This is saying, are you actually a legit client or legit person? And this is going to use that access token that we created before. And it's expected to be in a very specific format where it's bearer, a space, and then the entire token. So we can say plus access token like this. And so I'm just going to do a comma here, passing in the artist parameters. So if I want to add in variables to my request, I can start with a question mark. That means I want to start with the URL variables and set them one at a time. Even in the Spotify documentation, they recommended doing it this way. And so we can set that Q variable that they're expecting equal to our input from our search. So it's pretty much saying, what is the query? What data are you querying on? Well, I want to look up the person Taylor Swift, right? And we are saving that inside of our search input here. And also in the documentation, I want to specify a certain type. So what are you looking to get out of this search input? In our case, we can do an ampersand to say next variable. We want to get the artist out of that search query. And so we can say type is equal to artist. But this by itself isn't going to instantly give us that artist ID that we want. It's actually going to give us a block of data, which we can console log and take a look at. So we can do .then on this fetch request, take the response and turn it into some JSON for our JavaScript to read. Then we can do another .then here, name it data, and then we can say console.log data. Oh, I misspelled response. Okay, so if we go back to our application, we can then see if we look up Taylor Swift, press enter, we're then going to get an object of data, which is great news. This means the request went through. Then we can look at the artists that it gives back, and you'll see it's going to give us a bunch of different items. And you'll see Spotify is smart. They're giving us all these different items, but they're giving us the most relevant search query item at the very top. So you can imagine it's like Google. If I look up, how to cook chicken, it's going to give me the best chicken cooking recipe that Google knows at the very top. It's a very similar thing here, where you'll see the first thing in the array is Taylor Swift, the actual person Taylor Swift. And you'll see if I go to the second person, it's some strange Taylor Swift man thing that's not as It's not Taylor Swift, right? And so we can just say, take the artist of whoever is at the top of the search result, take that artist and just assume that is our person that we want to see all of their albums from. And when I'm talking about the artist ID, I'm talking about the ID you see right here. This is the unique identifier of Taylor Swift, for example, from this perspective of Spotify. So if we think about how do we get this ID out of the data, we can see we have to say .artists, which is going to give us access to all of this. Then we're going to have to say .items. Then we're going to go to the first item in the array and then do the .id. And so that's kind of how we're going to handle this request, is that process right there. So let's code that out. We can make some brackets here to make a return statement. And like we saw before, we can say data.artists.items, and then get the first person in the items array, which means the top of the search results like in Google, and then get their ID property. And we need this artist ID to make a query to get all of Taylor Swift's albums specifically, for example. And the reason why we're returning this string is because this return statement is then going to give this variable right here the value of whatever this is returning. So our artist ID is going to become the string of whatever this ID is here. So we're kind of saving the value of this, whatever this fetch gives us. And we can even confirm that by saying console.log artist ID is, and say plus artist ID here. This is just to make sure that we're actually getting a result from here. So now we have the artist ID. And so like we commented before, we're going to use the artist ID to grab all the albums from that specific artist. So I'm just going to say var albums is equal to this fetch statement we're going to make. So await fetch. And instead, we're going to go into https://api.spotify.com/v1/artists. So now we are in this part of the Spotify API where we're going to get the artist albums. And like you guys see, one of the required inputs is the actual Spotify ID of the artist. And so just like they have it here, let's go and add in this ID to our URL. So we can say plus artist ID like we saved above, and then continue it by saying /albums. And the fun doesn't end quite yet. So we're going to have to add a couple of variables to this fetch statement. So to the end of this URL, we're going to start by adding in all of our different variables we want to pass into this API request. For example, this include group string, we can then say only include things that are albums, for example, which is what we're going to do. You can also limit the amount of albums you receive, and you can also see the market which you want them in. I'm going to use the US, for example. And so let's pass those in. We can say include underscore groups is equal to album, then ampersand, which means we're going to have a new variable. Market is equal to US, which is the code we're going to need for the US market. You can do another ampersand for a new variable, and I'm going to say limit is equal to 50. And 50 is a lot of albums to receive, but some people have a lot of albums. So I just am increasing the limit so we don't miss out on any. And so this fetch request on line 47 here is actually going to use the same data for the artist parameters here. So I'm actually going to change this variable to search parameters. So search parameters, make sure you change it on line 41 here in your artist ID fetch. Then I'm also going to add it to the end of this. They are both just making calls to the Spotify API, and so their method of get and then the headers are going to be the same for each call. So now we can do then statements to handle the response of whatever our fetch returns. For the Spotify API, I always just make the data become a JSON, so I'm always doing that. Then we get to the important stuff after, where we have the finalized data at the end. And for here, I'm going to console.log the data and see what's inside of there. So we can actually run our application, and it's going to get to this point and show us this console log here. So we can look up Taylor Swift, press search, and boom, we're going to get 39 different albums from Taylor Swift. You guys will see, this isn't super specific to this video, but album is different than discography. So Taylor Swift, I think, has like 10 albums or something. I don't know, but definitely not 39. And so I think that's important here, is that this is showing everything from Spotify's perspective. Is it showing like the explicit versus the non-explicit versions? It's showing deluxe and not deluxe versions. And so you're going to get a lot of different albums. But with that said, let's take a look at the first album and take a look at some of the data around it. So all of these different albums are going to be structured the same. You're going to see it has an album group. It says album. It's going to have a name, which is Red Taylor's version, an absolute banger. It's going to tell you how many tracks are in the album. It's also going to tell you the specific URI for that album on Spotify. And really important is it's showing us the different images that are associated with this album. So you can actually take this image, copy it, and then paste it in a different tab. You're going to see, here we are. It is, big surprise, the album cover for Red Taylor's version. And if we want to see these other images that they have as options, you can then paste those in as well. And you'll see this is the smaller icon. So Spotify is pretty much just giving you options as far as the images go. For our case, though, we kind of want to save this entire items array. So we want all the different albums saved in our React application so we can display them all to the user, right? And so what we can do is we can create a state that is an empty array. And then once we get a bunch of new items, we can change that array to the new items array with all those different albums coming from your search request. So let's go in here and go to the top, and we can make a albums state. So albums and then set albums. I'm going to name this variable at line 48 returned albums so we don't run into any collisions there, just to be safe. Let's go back and finish this use state up, and now we're going to say use state is equal to an empty array initially. And so we know that if we go to our React application, this data.items is going to be that array of albums. So we can just set our state equal to that array. So we can keep that console log there just for housekeeping, and we can say set albums equal to data dot, let's check again, items. Okay. And so this is going to be a bunch of different albums here, which is great news. All right. And so now we can go back to our application, just run it again, see it still works. Boom, we're running into no errors, and it looks like it's going through successfully there, which is great news. At line 56, let's just console.log albums every single time, just to see what it looks like from our React application perspective, because we're then going to render these albums and show them to the user, right? So as you'll see, it is an empty array. We actually got to type in Taylor Swift. We're then going to search, and then as you'll see, we have all of our different albums, which is great news. That means we can show each album as a card in our React frontend. We can loop through this array and say, okay, I want to go to the album, and I want to show the name of the album, Red Taylor's version, and I want to show the first image, which is this image here. So let's go into the code and create that functionality. So right now we just have this card at line 78. We're now going to use this card, but we're going to render them for each thing in our array. And so you can do that by saying albums.map, which means we're going to map over the array. And it's kind of like looping through the array, except you get access to the actual object that you're at in the array, and then also the index in where you're mapping. So we can make an arrow function, and then we can have whatever JavaScript code we want inside of here to return the card with all the unique data from this specific album. So we can say return the card like this. Again, we can delete the card down here. And so now we have access to a specific album. And so if I console.log this album here, you guys will see what I'm talking about. So let's console.log this album, and I'm going to go back to our React application, and you guys will see we are seeing a bunch of empty albums. But let's look up Taylor Swift again. And this is great news. We're expecting to see like 39 albums or something like that. And so this means that it's recognizing there are 39 different cards, which is great. And so at each card, you have to think about this. What data do we need from this specific album? So our console.log is showing this. The album at each card is this little object, and it has the name and it has the images. So let's go and make these names unique. So we can go back to our code, and we can make the image source equal to the album dot, let's look again, images, and then I want the first one in that array. And so album dot images, then I'm going to say 0. And then I want the name of the album in there too. So I can then use these curly braces to say I want to do something like get this album here. Name is equal to album dot name. We're just getting a property out of that album object. So as you can see, all the names loaded correctly, which is great news, but we did something wrong. So let's go take a look. So this is actually a super great learning point. If you go to the images, you'll see each image is actually an object as well. So it has to be the album.images, get the first one, and then you want the .url, which is the point we were missing, is we want to get the specific URL out of that specific image. So in our code, we can add .url here. And there we go. You'll see we're loading in all of Taylor Swift's albums, which is super great. You'll see that we are kind of showing double when it comes to explicit versus non-explicit albums. In short, the Spotify API, it kind of sucks sometimes. One of the main flaws that this tutorial kind of exposes is the fact that when you look at a certain album, you're not able to tell if it's explicit or not explicit just based off of the album information, which is super unfortunate. And so we can take a look at these two Evermore Deluxe Edition objects. And I'm going to take a look at the first one. And you guys will see this has explicit things going on. If we go to the other link, so remember before we went to that link above, now we're going to the bottom link and we open that up on Spotify. It's showing us only the clean versions, or the not explicit ones. This is kind of interesting because Spotify doesn't indicate anywhere in the album object whether or not an album is explicit or not explicit. So the main reason why I'm explaining that is that this actually isn't really our fault. If you want to show only explicit albums or only the non-explicit ones, what you would have to do is you have to manually grab every single album as you get it, go through the album songs, and then see if there are any explicit ones. Yeah, kind of a headache, right? I'm just kind of including this part of the video to show you guys why I'm making certain decisions and kind of how you should approach software development yourself. For example, in this case, it doesn't really affect me much. It's kind of an annoyance, but it's okay because we still have kind of what I wanted to achieve for this video, which was dynamically loading in data from a bunch of different sources and getting it from an API. And we can also do a bunch of different people as well. And if you look up someone like Kanye, for example, you'll see that there are even more issues when it comes to different versions of a certain album. Even though we're only looking at the US market, if we go the Watch to Throne, we can even see this. How Spotify is getting all these albums for Kanye, for example, is it's taking a look at all these different releases that Spotify has here. You'll have all these edited ones, and then there was even another different one. Looks like edited ones again. And then you pretty much have the regular Watch the Throne. So Spotify doesn't really have a discography. I know this is an API video, but the difference between discography and all of an artist's albums on Spotify is that the discography is every single unique album. When you try to get all the albums from a certain artist, you're going to see that it's getting like every single piece of album information. So the edited ones, the explicit versus unexplicit, maybe just a different version for whatever reason. For example, Watch the Throne Deluxe has 3 different ones. This is just giving some explanation as to where all of these values are coming from in our React application. All right, so this is kind of where I'm going to end the video. We can even do a couple of different searches of whatever artist you want, and you'll see we'll get all their different albums they have on Spotify. And so hopefully this video was helpful in getting some initial understanding of what it means to work with an API, especially like Spotify. You'll see that once you've worked with one API and get a really good idea of how to handle data, how to handle these objects that you're getting, you kind of get a really streamlined process as to what it means to create a dynamic React application that can load in information dynamically. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope this video was helpful.